So, in Valorant, everyone makes mistakes and makes them often, right? We here at SkillCapped clearly recognize this fact as we spend hours and hours VOD reviewing and picking apart gameplay of hundreds of our clients each week. We found that some of these mistakes that we witness are so insanely consistent at each rank, and a lot of players don't even recognize the mistakes when they happen, even when they're extremely simple mistakes to make. Here are the 8 biggest mistakes made while we reviewed players from the lowest rank even up to the highest ranks, like Immortal 3 and Radiant. For our first couple mistakes, we're going to be taking a look at our aiming capabilities of players. This is going to be some very key information here, so make sure you're paying attention when we talk about these mistakes. The first mistake is a glaring mistake we see all the time, and it's the floating crosshair. The floating crosshair goes hand in hand with crosshair placement and can be heavily overlooked by many players. So what is floating crosshair, you might ask? Simply put, the floating crosshair is a crosshair that flows freely around the screen with no real direction when there's action going on. It all comes down to a lack of crosshair discipline rather than standard crosshair placement. Most players that have issues with the floating crosshair have great crosshair placement, yet when action happens that distracts them from the game, their crosshair is floating around with no direction while the player is thinking and gathering info. Reducing the floating crosshair is an easy fix. All you need to do is focus on being more aware of where your crosshair is traveling in moments that you otherwise really would have nothing else going on. The reason this is good is because if you're paying close attention to where your crosshair is and have it trained where there's even the slightest potential of you getting peeked, you'll end up with a much higher success rate in the gunfight than if you were to have your crosshair aimlessly wandering throughout your screen. And look, learning to take gunfights effectively with your pre-aim and crosshair placement is by far the most important part of improving at Valorant. At the end of the day, even if you make all the correct decisions leading up until the gunfight, if you end up missing your shots, you will lose. If you're new to the game or just struggling with your aim recently, we've got just the thing to bring your aim up to a competitive level and start taking over your matches. We recently produced an interactive hour-long masterclass on aim, complete with everything you need to know about becoming an aim god in Valorant. This course alone has what you need to be able to climb all the way up to Diamond in Valorant. Combine that with everything else on the site, as well as the one-on-one coaching that we do for our site subscribers over on our Discord, we guarantee we can get you climbing in no time. In fact, our guarantee is so strong that we'll give you your money back if we can't help you climb. This means it's literally no risk to you, which is something other services just don't even offer. Use the link in the description below for a discount, and we'll see you there. Moving on to our second tip. This is quite a large issue that plagues the ranks of Valorant. It happens at literally every rank, but it's more frequently seen at Diamond and below. This mistake is using way more utility than the situation calls for, and even improperly wasting ultimate abilities. Now, we're not saying hold on to every piece of utility for rounds at a time, but make sure when you use the utility, it has a purpose. Try and make those small, snap decisions in your mind when you're about to use your utility. Why am I throwing this utility? Is there a push imminent? Do I want to reposition? Understand the purpose as to which you're spending the piece of utility that could otherwise be spent later in the round. One of the biggest examples we can give is wasting mollies when there's little to no presence shown around the map. Now, we understand that sometimes utility needs to be burned in order to make repositioning as a solo player more feasible. But don't burn a molly the second you hear one footstep in A main. One of the best times to use mollies is when a piece of info utility makes its way onto site. This should effectively shut down most of the enemy team from entering site based off the info utility, and also gives you a decent chance to reposition from your location as the enemy now knows where you are. In conclusion, be smart about your utility usage. Have a plan for the piece of utility that you're throwing and a decent reasoning for it, and this will help you preserve utility pieces that could otherwise be the determining factor of a round. This mistake is one that everyone, without fail, has made before, even unknowingly. Shutting down. Giving up when the scoreline hits a certain point where you feel as though the win is either just not worth it or it's not even possible. Most people have had this happen here. The scoreline is 0-5. Nobody's saying a word. Your team's losing every possible gunfight, and the insta-lock jet type GG in the chat. This has happened in my games personally very, very often. So how do you combat this? Well, it's not always possible, but in these games, if it's played right, you can bring them from a 5% win rate to a 40% average win rate in games like this. Sure, not above 50%, but way higher than a measly 5%. How do you combat and start winning games like this that seem impossible though? Simply ask a question. Something along the lines of, so what are we doing wrong? Usually gets people talking here. If your team cares even in the slightest about winning, hearing these words will usually spark a conversation about what everyone in particular thinks the issue is that your team is facing. Once the team is talking, your win rate has just increased a lot, and the enjoyability factor even sometimes. Simply asking this question specifically has turned games around for me so many times. I've won games simply because I asked what we're doing wrong, and it sparked my team to actually work together to find a solution to the issues that we're facing. Once your team is talking, listen to what they're saying and determine if you've observed anything they've said. Offer your own personal input in a kind manner and figure out by working with your team what you can all do better. It's usually not often one person's entire fault in situations like this where the scoreline is so drastic, so try not to pin blame on anyone and be willing to accept responsibility yourself. We feel like this really needs to be said, but right when the barrier drops on defender side, please stop peeking out garage doors on Haven and dying instantly. We understand sometimes you're having a really good game and you want to challenge your opponents to a fight, which is fine. But if they shut you down a couple times, show some restraint and play passive for a round or two. In Valorant, there's a few main playstyles, one of them being aggressive and confident playstyles, the other one being the more passive, slow playstyle, where you play the push-pull game with the enemy team, taking and giving certain areas of the map as the round progresses. Understand that you don't always have to play one or the other for the whole game. We've noticed that easily one of the biggest problems people tend to have where they're having a bad game is right when they get off a hot streak of doing well. They try to immediately replicate the playstyle they were using in the previous game when they dropped 35 kills, but the issue is they're playing against an entirely new enemy team. Generally, when we see these players have high kill followed by low kill games, it's because their playstyle carried over and the enemy properly adapted to counter them. Generally, when this happens, players tend to get confused and they tilt, rather than just pivot into another playstyle that could rather help them out. An example of this would be aggressive peeking and dying over and over. When this happens, just take a step back, recognize it, reset, take a deep breath, and play passive in the same area and fight for the space that they're attempting to contest. This is a very, very common issue we see across almost every rank in Valorant. Now, we understand that in Valorant, some teams lean towards just rushing, which is fine, but try and direct your team away from that notion if this happens often. You're pushing B site on Ascent, Sova drones into B main, and in order to gain access to that space, your team fully takes control of B main and a brimstone smoke comes in. What usually happens here though? Generally, what we notice is teams get into a situation where they make a call to hit B off the start of the round. Right when that smoke comes in, oftentimes nobody will push through it. Yes, it can be a very bad idea to push through a smoke. That's not what we're saying here. What we're trying to bring attention to is the lack of map control and utility bait from your team. When playing Valorant, at the start of the round, most rounds, each team has full utility. When you start a push and decide to cancel it after using your team's utility, you are in a very bad position to try and win the round. Not only is most of your key info utility and smokes gone, but the enemy team has more than likely only used a couple smokes and mollies. And at this point, your team's forced to make a decision to wait out the smokes or attempt to retake map control from an enemy team that most likely has pushed into more contested zones of the map, all with little utility remaining from your team. Okay, so here's what you do instead. Direct your team into a default. Have them pressure areas of the map in order to bait out the enemy team's utility, track what utility is being used, and a good time to decide to hit is midway through the round when something has happened. An example of this would be a pick is gained in an area of the map or the brimstone has burned all his smokes. pressure areas, burn the utility, and hit the weak points from the defenders where their numbers and utility will be the weakest. This is a huge problem we notice on defender side, and this is also a prevalent issue at every rank. Say your Cypher is defending B site on Ascent. Your team notices that there is no presence anywhere else in the map. Based off that knowledge, you can reasonably assume it's a B hit, right? Absolutely not. Just because there's heavy presence B site doesn't necessarily mean that it'll be a B execute. Players will often fake a lot of presence in one area for the sole purpose of causing you to over-rotate. Keep that in mind here. Remember what we talked about in the last mistake? That knowledge is useful because now you can apply it to your defender side to better understand how the enemy may be playing around out. The big problem here is players tend to get antsy when there's no presence on one side of the map, but heavy presence elsewhere. Defenders may get nervous and rotate because they don't trust their teammate on the opposite side, or they want to help their teammate on the other side. The best piece of advice we can give here is to communicate with your team on the opposite side. Ask them to tell you when the enemy team actively starts entering site and taking space on site. Once you get that call from your teammate, it would be a good time to either rotate or get ready to. And obviously, use your discretion with this. If the enemy team burns Brimstone ult, Phoenix ult, all their utility, and you see them coming out or your teammates are dying on site, don't wait for the call, just rotate. But when there's pressure on the other side of the map, but nobody has exited the choke to attempt to take site, just wait for a minute. Try and understand what's happening before making a hasty decision to just leave the site you're defending. This happens all the time. Your team's doing extremely well, you have insanely good momentum, you end the half up 10-2 or even 11-1 and you lose pistol. From there, your team's still in a laid-back mindset as the scoreline is so spread that there's no reason to worry. But then the enemy team gets the momentum that your team had and start bringing the game back round by round until your team starts to tilt and eventually goes on to lose the game. Sounds pretty common, at least for me that is. The way we see it is, the game is not over until 13 rounds is won. Don't check out early. Continue to put forth a real effort in order to ensure that you're winning the game. What people fail to realize is that even in a very spread game score-wise, if the enemy team wins pistol, there's a good chance they're going to win the next. If they win their bonus, they'll then win the next. At this point, they've gotten 4 rounds off just pistol round, and they've gained momentum in their favor. If your team loses the following rifle round, 5 rounds into the half, your team's mental state is instantly gonna plummet. Make sure you're communicating with your team. Each round in the second half is extremely important no matter how well your team was at one point doing. Don't get too complacent here, but also don't complain constantly that you're losing, as that only serves to upset everyone else further. Just be cognizant of what's happening with the scoreline at all times. This is a fairly common mistake that happens with players nearly every game also. This mistake is similar to over-aggression here, but mainly hits on the attacker side of things, especially with duelist players. Now, we're not trying to go after duelist players here either, but it's definitely most common in them as their kit is tailored for a highly aggressive playstyle. When you're attacking site as a team, please, everyone, take note of where your players are. Is the initiator still walking up? Are your duelists in the back line? Is the Sage with res preparing to entry into site? All of these are red flags that need to be addressed before hitting. Something as simple as saying, "Play safe, Sage, you have res," could be a complete round-determining factor. If you notice things are out of order, attempt to fix them before attacking site. Also, if your initiator isn't close and ready to initiate the push, communicate with them and have them stun or flash or drone you in so there's some informational or flashing utility assisting your push onto site. The easiest way to get everyone in order and ready to hit is to give your team a set time to start the execute, something along the lines of, "Let's hit the site when the timer reads 1:30, so your team has plenty of time to prepare for what's about to happen. Also note that if your team is planning on using ultimates to secure the site, that you wait for the ultimates to be used so you can capitalize on their intended effect. Don't push straight in the second a Killjoy ultimate goes down. Wait for 5 or so seconds so the enemy team is off site, and wait for the smokes to come in so they have no line of sight into the choke point. If Brimstone is ulting Generator on A site, don't push out before the ultimate goes out. Wait until it pops so the enemy will be forced out of position while you're pushing. That way, your team can capitalize. Don't own an ult backside before your team is even through the choke point. Simple things like this are such glaring factors that oftentimes cause teams to throw away some of the easiest rounds to win. Manage your team's position upon entry to site and make sure the ultimates being used have a form of follow-up. That's going to be all for today's video. We hope that we addressed some of the biggest and most commonly overlooked issues in Valorant. Honestly, there's so many guides on such simple information, but none about the more niche topics that can definitely make or break an entire game or round. Master and hone in on the ability to recognize these issues while you're playing, and also the ability to adapt and pivot you and your team's playstyle mid-game. With these new pieces of info in your arsenal, your personal skill level is sure to skyrocket. Once you brush up on your mechanics, we encourage you to head on over to our Discord, where you can get coached by a top player and figure out all the mistakes you're making and how to fix them. Our goal at SkillCapped is to provide users as much value as we possibly can, which is exactly why we give you direct access to our coaching staff to figure out the exact issue that you're having and how to fix it. This is also the reason why if we don't provide you value, you don't pay. This is assured by our rank improvement guarantee that we offer to all users who sign up for our site. So what are you waiting for? Check out SkillCapped using the link below. And other than that, we'd like to thank you all for watching this one, and we'll catch you in the next one.